tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
This is Chad Graham of Thinker Sensitive on the rise of socialism. I'm here with Ben Crenshaw, my co-host. Ben, thanks for being with us on this episode on universal basic income.
Thanks, Chad.
Yeah, man. So let's get right down to the nitty-gritty of this. Universal basic income has become a very popular kind of catchphrase, buzzword in social media and economic policy shifts lately in the last couple of years. Tell us a little bit about what UBI is. We're going to call it UBI. What is universal basic income? And let's land on how that fits in a free market and then also in a socialist economy.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, the basic idea behind a UBI is the attempt to essentially alleviate poverty or deprivation, people in need, and so forth. And so it's the idea that the government is going to give every person in America, every single person without exception, a set amount of money every month for the entire year. And so something like every person in America, if you're 21 or older, is going to get between $12,000 and $13,000 a year or something like that. So $1,000 in your bank account, $800, whatever it may be.
And Bernie Sanders is even recommending something like a $40,000 a year salary, maybe $30,000 salary, $10,000 benefit, which basically equates out to $2 trillion.
Yeah, so with the Sanders plan, he combines UBI with a minimum $15 minimum wage.
Right.
And so the whole issue of the minimum wage is a possible tack on. You could include that with the UBI, but you don't have to. And there's a huge problems with the minimum wage, not only historically and philosophically and morally, but especially economically. So we could riff on the minimum wage for a long time.
Episode.
But you risk the problem with Sanders' plan of taking two bad ideas and putting them together for a catastrophic consequence.
Okay.
So yeah, the UBI, part of the issue with the UBI, like I said, is just a different approach to welfare and how we can provide welfare benefits for those who are deserving. Because the welfare state is massive today in America and in Europe, and it's hemorrhaging money, it is unsustainable, it's corrupt, it's reduplicative, all kinds of things. The other issue is the issue of the coming job automation. And there's a huge fear, both people on the right and the left. And there's disagreements among everybody, regardless of your political persuasion, of whether or not job automation is going to push out human workers, especially in white-collar jobs now. You could have things like self-driving trucks. So everyone who's a trucker today, I don't know how many millions of truckers drive every day in the United States, but all of them could be out of a job. That's more of a blue-collar job. But the issue is, AI and automation could lead to masses of unemployment, and then what are we going to do? Yeah. Now, other people like, say, Jay Richards, who just wrote The Human Advantage, doesn't think that that's going to happen. And there's good arguments to think that once human labor and capital is taken over by automated systems, it just frees up humans to be more innovative and entrepreneurial and
build
to find
on top of the technology.
Exactly. Yeah. Find new ways and new horizons and avenues to work and innovate and come up with things that we haven't done before. And we see this throughout history, of course. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, somebody like Charles Murray will say, no, this is what's known as a J curve. So a J curve is on a graph. It kind of increases slowly, and then you hit a point where, boom, it shoots up. And so automation over the past 200, 300 years has been slowly increasing, and so humans have been able to adapt to it and evolve. Yeah. But all of a sudden we might hit this point.
Vocation and changing job training.
Exactly. Okay. So, but then we might hit this point where automation just takes off.
Yeah.
That leaves
some invention takes us to this next level of automation.
Right, exactly. Or some kind of UI makes it possible to create robots that could take over 90% of human jobs. Something like that.
Yeah.
And so there's this fear gives rise to, the problem of mass unemployment, and then comes the discussion about a UBI.
Yeah. And so, Ben, tell us about how would this look? What does UBI look like in our current landscape? What would this look like in a free market economy? Because one of the things that see, and one of the things I worry about, is if we did switch over to a model like this, it kind of looked like, anything else, the college industry, the education industry, where, the government starts to provide almost limitless subsidy, right? And rather than more people being able to attend college and go to college and get these advanced degrees, what happens is colleges just continue to raise tuition prices and expand their campuses to add student centers and things like that, that aren't necessarily vital to the education process, but actually help the college prosper. And, they're all good things. But what happens is college just keeps getting more expensive because, it's the government dumping these funds into a free market, and free market enterprise is taking advantage of that.
Right.
And rightfully so. Is that what would happen with a universal basic income? Things would just get a lot more expensive and we'd still have to work anyway on top of this UBI? Yeah,
so I feel a little bit conflicted about the UBI because it really all depends upon implementation. And there's a couple of points there. So if it's just going to be another socialist and welfare program on top of everything we have, it's going to be disastrous. Yeah. And if it's going to be the kind of thing where it's not universal or equitably universal, meaning those who are more needy can get $15,000 or $20,000 a year, and only, then you're going to have perverse incentives within the system, and you're going to have government officials that are going to try to be finding the neediest voting bloc as their beneficiaries, and those people are going to be petitioning government for special exceptions and so forth. Now, someone like Charles Murray would say that a UBI could be implemented within a market system in a positive way, at least theoretically, as long as there's some kind of basic requirements that are met. And the first requirement is that the current welfare system in totality, all of it would be scrapped. So we're talking about all the poverty programs, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of it would be gone.
Yeah.
Everything from FDR to LBJ to Obama, gone. And what it would take its place would be the UBI. And there would be parity. Everybody would get the same amount, so no one has an advantage over anyone else. This would actually, Murray thinks it would save America money, because right now we spend how many trillions of dollars a year on these programs that are already unsolvent, and we have something like $200 trillion of unfunded liabilities and Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We can't possibly pay for these things, and they're running out of control. And part of the reason they're running out of control is because there's no checks and balances. There's perverse incentives within these programs. A lot of them are duplicates of one another. They're all a little bit different, but they all try to do the same thing. And so if you just wipe all that out and you deposit a certain amount of money in someone's account every month, then it elicits moral agency and responsibility, and not accountability to the government. Because if you go and blow your $1,000 on vacation or Cheetos or beer, too bad. The government's not going to bail you out.
Yeah.
And so you have to learn fiscal responsibility, accountability to your family and your neighbors. And so Murray actually thinks that if it's equal and if it totally replaces the welfare state, it could actually lead to a potential revival of civic America. So there's potential there for it, but it requires this incredible honesty and self-restraint by the government.
So a potential, any active listener who's an avid capitalist will say, okay, what happens when, we provide this service, this subsidy, and the person who does blow their entire money on vacation or whatever superfluous thing, right? That money's gone. They need money to live. They're without a net now because they had opportunity to blow it faster than they could sustain themselves. Isn't it just ripe for the picking for another politician to come through and gather all those folks up and say, well, I've got a new plan where, if that happens to you, you can apply for this new program. And then we have this budget creep again, like just that always seems to happen in this type of economy. Do you think that's what would happen?
It could, very well. And with the history of our government and with other massive governments that are supposed to be limited but spiral out of control, it's a real fear.
Yeah.
So if that is likely to happen, I wouldn't be an advocate for the UBI. Preferably what I'd like to see in the case of somebody who blows it
Yeah.
is that they have to go to those they know
Yes.
locally around them, their family, their friends, their pastor, their mentor, their professor, and they have to say, gee, man, I blew it. I spent all my money. I was irresponsible. Can you help me out? And suddenly they face
real accountability.
Yeah, there's real accountability. They face a shame for having been irresponsible. They face having to rely upon others. And those other people hopefully would say, well, I'm willing to help you this time, but you need to make some changes in your life. Part of the problem with the welfare system today is there's none of that. There's none of that local accountability. So your neighbor doesn't actually have responsibility for you.
Right.
What they do every year is they pay their taxes to the government. And they have no idea if their taxes are paying the interest on the national debt, they're paying for Nancy Pelosi's private jet,
Right.
or they're actually paying for food stamps.
Right.
We have no way of knowing.
And most people feel like they've paid into their civic duty because they paid their taxes, and this distance has kind of been created between those in need who really need more than just money.
Absolutely.
So talk to me a little bit about this civic duty, this idea that these local institutions, these civic responsibilities can actually take the place of, or not take the place of, but at least come alongside of government subsidy.
Right. Yeah, the interesting thing is when you study government and society, political economy, and so forth, what you'll find is that oftentimes in discussions about the nature of civilization, you find that there's the government on the one hand and the individual on the other. But society is not reducible to either one of those.
Mm-hmm.
And if you only think of civilization, human societies, as the government and the individual, which is essentially what the welfare state does, is just the individual and the government and the individual. What somebody like Patrick Deneen argues in his Why Liberalism Failed is that these play off each other because the individual is needy, so they go to the government that empowers the government, which then gives a lot to the individual, which just fragments and atomizes them further. So then they become needy and they go to the government, and it just plays off one another, and it's this vicious cycle. Well, if you go back and say, if you read someone like Thomas Paine in his Common Sense, you'll find he's saying society existed before government existed.
Yes.
And so society is actually everything in between the government and the individual. These are the mediating institutions.
Yes.
This is your family, your church, your local government, your city council, your civic center, your classical academy, your university, you name it, your bowling team. These are all the things
Local institutions.
most of us normal people engage in all the time. Us right now doing a podcast at a church. This is civil society. And throughout most of throughout most of American history, civil society has been the bread and butter of America. That's what made America America. If you go read de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, he talks about the nature of America's civic institutions.
Yes.
And how vibrant they were and how this set
Organic and
America
voluntary.
apart. Exactly.
Yes.
So what we have in America today is really a breakdown of civil society, these civic institutions, something like marriage. Marriage has completely fallen apart. You have people who aren't engaged in their local economy or their local politics. They are totally focused on national, international economy or national politics. You have educational institutions that don't actually serve the people in their community. They bring people from out of state or out of country. And so there's a breakdown of civic America. And you can read somebody like Charles Murray in his book Coming Apart, which demonstrates that.
Excellent. Yes. Okay, and so let's also think about how I know that you had some key points that you wanted to talk about in universal basic income in terms of more civic union, more ideas of how to balance the morality of welfare against the ideas of responsibility for the state. Why don't you share some of those with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that if a country was thinking about how to provide best for their citizens from the get-go. You know,
Yes.
it's like we're starting with a blank check. We're going to write this thing from the ground up. I would not really recommend a universal basic income as the way to go.
Yeah.
I do think that there's an issue of social contract here. If the people all decide to contract together and they say, well, we're willing to be taxed X amount or have a sales tax or a value-added tax or something like that, a tax on goods and services or income or whatever it may be, and that's how we're going to pay for it. If all the people agree to it, that's okay, because unlike a welfare system, which functions based on transferring money from one income group to another, basically those who earn it and those who do not, there's a moral problem there. Without consent, you're
Right.
just using the bully pulpit, the power, the violence, the monopoly
military
on
state.
violence that the government has to extract money from one group and give it to another, supposedly for a charitable reason, but it's hard to justify charity by the sword.
Right.
So you could possibly do something like a UBI within a moral framework if it was a social contract agreed upon everybody. This is how we're going to provide for one another. I think, however, there's a better way. And the better way, ironically, is just to go back and look at American history. So if you go back, you know, it's amazing. We have the welfare state today, and we can't imagine life without it. But for most of American history, there was no such thing as food stamps or Social Security. Your children were your Social Security, your neighbors, your church family, and so forth. So there was no welfare state. LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, launched the welfare state in 1965. Before that, there was some innovation during the presidency of FDR in initiating some of these programs. Although if you go back and look at the initial nature of Social Security, it was so small.
So different.
And it included a very tiny portion of the population. And of course, this is how social programs metastasize and become gigantic and problematic. But
And
if
go from a work program to a net program.
Exactly, yeah. An entitlement program.
Yes.
But if we go back and look at American history, we find that the American founders, the founding fathers, those who drafted the political charter for our country, they talked a lot about poverty and welfare because it was an issue then, and they were concerned about it. And they kind of came up with basically 6 major ideas of how they wanted to combat and provide for the neediest among them. And the first was, ironically, to establish free markets and private property, that people ought to work and provide for themselves and keep a fruit of their own labor as their own property. And that was one way they could provide for themselves, and that was one way that if they made enough, they could be charitable and generous toward others. So the market was a real system, a real way to provide for people in need, and it even is today. There's massive amounts of charity in the United States. I think actually that private charity in the United States far exceeds foreign aid that the U.S. gives out every year, by far.
Yeah.
The second idea that they came up with is that there should be strong support for lifelong marriages and a sense of personal morality, self-control, and restraint. So marriage was a huge way that societies or people could cohere together and provide for themselves, one another, both within the family and between family units. The third issue was that it was the government of the local community that was going to provide charity and assume responsibility for its poor.
Not an abstract federal machine, mechanized system, right? These are people who are actually interfacing with their local person of need who needed help, probably financially, but also in a number of other ways, education, training, things like that.
Exactly. And part of the issue here is what's known within the socialist debate as the knowledge problem. And the knowledge problem was raised by the economists, both by Ludwig von Mises and by Friedrich Hayek. And the knowledge problem is that a federal government, whether it's functioning on the basis of a socialized economy or an authoritarian political regime, just doesn't have access to the local issues to know who needs what, when, how much. You know, if you give it to them, are they going to abuse it? do you give them money and food stamps, or do they actually need to be admitted into some kind of program or something like that? And so there's a knowledge problem. And so the founders said, no, let's keep welfare local. The fourth issue is that it was the administrators of the program who will actually know the situations and the people who ask for help. So that kind of gets into the third and fourth point kind of go together.
The localized aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then fifth, there was a distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. So it wasn't just anybody who asked for help and said, I need help, I drink all my money away or whatever it may be, who gets it. There was people who were undeservingly poor and who needed to be admitted to, say, a halfway house. And they needed to work, and they needed some discipline, and they needed some encouragement, and they needed to be taught some skills. Other people were more deserving. They were completely disabled, or they medically had a problem or something like that. So there was this distinction. Just anybody who raises a white flag and says, I need help, doesn't necessarily qualify. And then the poor laws in the founding era were not meant to go beyond a minimal safety net. So really, it was meant to be, we will keep you from starving, but we're not going to provide a cushy life for you so you can just continue to live this way. It's going to be the kind of thing where you will survive, but you want to get out of this.
Yes.
So there was incentives built into these programs to try to move people into work, into marriage, into a functional role within civil society so that they could provide for themselves for the most part or something like that. And of course, part of the issue here is in the founding era, there was a different culture, a culture that stigmatized being a bum,
yes,
not working, not being willing to get married, feeling entitled to the fruits of other people's labor and so forth. A lot of that has gone away today. And so I think that basically what we found between the founding era and 1960s was this vibrant civil society in America that had all kinds of fraternities and mutual aid societies, beyond what you could imagine, for medical care, for education, all kinds of things that people could turn to, where you had experts who would be a part of this and they would administer aid and you would pay a fee to be a part of it and so forth. And in fact, I saw a statistic recently, and it said that all of the charity provided by these mutual aid societies in New York City exceeded the amount that New Yorkers are taxed today.
It's incredible.
In order to provide a social safety net and the welfare state. So this is a doable way to provide for people and to avoid a lot of the vices and the problems that we have with welfareism or universal basic income.
So I want to end with one more subject related to UBI. You and I have been in conversations with many socialists who have expressed the idea that work is actually an oppressor or an inhibitor to living out their best life or to finding a way to really enjoy the pleasures of life. What do you think about that? Do you think that universal basic income would encourage that style of thinking and people would stop finding meaning in their work? Or do you think they would find meaning in other things and it really would be effective in liberating all of the oppressed workers of the world? Or what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it depends upon what you mean by basic.
Yeah.
If a basic income is going to be $50,000 a year, then it's going to definitely disincentivize work.
Right.
And we're going to have a huge problem of a stagnant
population,
sifting class of non-workers. But if you set it at like $10,000 or $12,000 a year, that will keep you right about the poverty line. You're going to be able to survive, but it's really not going to be very comfortable. The good thing about a UBI is it doesn't disincentivize or stigmatize work. You're not penalized if you go out and make more money. It's not like you're going to lose your basic income. So it would allow somebody to say you have a single mom with a kid who's got a universal basic income of $12,000 a year. She has a boyfriend. He moves in with her, and all of a sudden you have $24,000 a year. Then say he gets a job paying minimum wage, which gives him another $12,000, and all of a sudden you're up to $36,000 a year, and that's livable. Mm-hmm. So it can work with work. But to go back to the other problem of just the idea that work somehow oppresses us, I don't think that that's accurate. Without a theology of work, you might come to that conclusion. Because work can be grinding. Of course, work can be monotonous. It can be difficult. We spend a lot of our lives at work. You know how it is. You get up in the morning, you go to work, you come home, you grab a bite to dinner, you watch a show, and then it's time to go to bed.
Yeah.
You live for the weekends and vacations, and all of a sudden 30 years goes by, and that's your life. Without a theology of work, the idea that God had created work to be good, and it was partly a participation with Him in what it means to be a person and what it means to create something and cultivate and have the fruit of our labor and the reward for that. And then the fall, of course, brings thorns and thistles and curses and tears and agony and pain to work. Without that theology, you can't really make sense of work today, and that's why a lot of socialists will say that work is a curse or somehow it oppresses them.
Right.
So I don't think we ought to believe that, and we ought to wrestle with our work the way we do with every other area of life, and be able to find meaning in work, even though it's difficult, and to be able to experience both success and failure, and to learn from both of those. And if you have social welfare policies that disincentivize work, you have really a stunted human being. They don't learn to work. They don't learn to wrestle with it. They don't learn from their failures. They don't learn how to be responsible with their successes. And so that's a problem.
This is Ben Crenshaw and Chad Graham on Universal Basic Income. Stick around for our next policy episode on universal health care and free college tuition. Ben, thanks for being on the show today. Appreciate you coming down.
Thank you, Chad.
For more Thinker-Sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com. Be sure to find us on iTunes and YouTube as well.